Hey everyone, welcome to another tutorial with me, Tim Clapham from helloluxx.com, and in this tutorial we're going to be exploring some of the new features of XParticles 3. We're going to be working in Cinema 4D of course, and we're going to render this out, jump over to After Effects to finish up our project later. As you can see in the viewport here, we have the Lux logo. Now of course you can use any object of your pleasing. A logo, it could be type. It's entirely up to you. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this to emit particles from, and we're going to wipe from left to right. So these particles are going to start from the left side and then travel across to the right hand side, moving around the interior of our logo. We're going to then trace those using the XParticles trail object and render this using hair. Once we've done that, we can set up a few cameras, output our renders and comp that together in After Effects. Let's come to our XParticles menu, come down and add in an emitter first of all, and I'm going to call this XP emitter 01. If we just press play, you can see that we get a flurry of particles being emitted from this. So we don't want to use this setting on our emitter, so let's select this and bring up our attributes. Under the object tab for the emitter shape, in here we have a few options, and we're going to choose object, and that allows us to drag an object into this object field. So let's grab our polygon object, and in this example I'm using the Lux logo. I'm just going to drag and drop that into the field, and now if we press play you can see that we're emitting from our logo. Now I did want to start the emission from one side and have it travel across the object and then finish up this side, so that we almost wipe the logo on and then wipe it off. Down below the object field we have this option, emit from polygon center, and we have a few options in here. So we could emit from polygon area, but the option that we want to choose here is we're going to use a texture. So now if we rewind and press play, you can see that we're getting a flurry of particles over the whole object. We haven't actually specified a texture at all yet, but you can see that once we've chosen texture, we have this texture use group that's unfolded with a whole bunch of parameters. And in this field here, we need to drag a texture tag. We don't have any materials in this scene, so of course we need to double click in our material manager to create a new material. Let's call this emission. We can switch to the basic tab, uncheck reflectance, and just leave our color channel enabled. In this color channel I'm going to drop a gradient for now, and if we just right click on here and choose plane, so we can see that as a 2D preview. Next thing to do is grab this and drag and drop this onto our polygon object. Now you notice that this object doesn't actually have any UVWs. There's no UVW tag. Because of that, you can see down here in the attribute manager that the projection has defaulted to spherical. Now let's set this to be flat, and if we come over and switch to our texture mode, I'm also just going to press L to switch to axis mode, and then what we can do is press T and we can scale this up so that that gradient fits across our object perfectly, like so. To use the texture tag option in here, we can drag our tag into this field, and this then enables the other parameters. Now we're emitting using our color channel because this is where we've added our gradient, so we need to leave the emit channel to color. You can also use this to define the color of your particles. But there is a very important thing that we should consider before we move forward, and that is that this will only work with UVW coordinates. We've actually set this tag up using a flat projection, and we need to use UVW. But because it's such a simple shape, we can simply right click on this tag and we can choose generate UVW coordinates, and this is now using UVWs, and it's created the UVW coordinates based on that flat projection. Come down to the material manager and select that material once again. Let's just open up this gradient. I'm going to grab this black knot and just pull this across, and grab this white knot and pull this up, so that we basically have a black and white kind of two stripes. If we press play now, you can see that the particles are only emitting from the white side. So that's working. It's now using that texture. So what I'd like to do is animate this gradient so that we move, we start off all black, and then we move the white across, and then we wipe the black across again. I'm working in HD frame, and I'm working at 100 frames in total. 25 frames a second, so we've got 4 seconds. Let's come to the window menu, and I'm going to open up the timeline. And we're not going to use this much, but I just wanted to show you something, because what we want to do here is we want to add in a couple more knots. Let's add in another white knot, and let's add in another black knot, like so. So we've got this black, white, black setup. And then we're going to keyframe this gradient. But one of the things that you should bear in mind when keyframing a gradient is you're going to end up with loads of tracks. Let's just click to create a key for this gradient, and in the timeline you can see we have our gradient. But if we fold this down, you can see that we actually have a huge number of tracks, and we're not really interested in all of these. We don't need to worry about the bias, the intensity, the color, or anything like that. All we're really interested in is the position of those knots. So I'm going to select this and delete this to get rid of that animation. Let's come back to our gradient. If we right click on here and choose user interface show subchannels, we can then see all of those subchannels, all those parameters that were keyed a moment ago, and really we're interested only in these position values. And we can keyframe those to move these knots up and down, and you can see that it gives us a percentage which refers to how far along the gradient that knot sits. If we look at the order of the colours, it goes black, white, so it's a little bit confusing knowing which is which, and that's because of the order that I added them in, and you can see from the percentage whereabouts they are. But just to make it simpler, let's just make this one white, and let's make this black, and just swap those around. And now we can see that the order that these are placed in is the order that they are along here. So let's grab this first knot, and let's grab the second knot, and this second knot I'm going to set to be 0.001. Okay, and then this next knot 0.002, and then finally this black 0.003, like so. So it's almost black, and there's a few bunched up knots at the end there. If we just close this timeline down and have a look, and you can see that now we have a totally black logo, and when we press play we don't have any particles. Good stuff. And the first thing we want to do is to keyframe these two. So I'm going to just select this and add a key for those two positions. Next I'm going to come to, say, around 25. For the first black, I'm going to set that to 100. And then for the white, I'm going to set that to 99.99, like so. And now let's add another key for those two. So now if we scrub through, you can see that's starting to work. And as we press play, you can see the particles wipe on. So that's looking pretty cool. So now at frame 25, what we want to do is we want to keyframe the white and the black that are at this end. So we select the position for these two. Let's add a key here, and let's now move forward to around, say, frame 50, and we've got this at 99.99, so let's set this to be 99.98, and let's set this to be 99.97, like so, and add in another key. And you can see now, if we drag through, that the white wipes across the logo, and then the black wipes across. So if we press play, you can see that it emits particles while the white is there, but once the black appears, it stops emitting. So we've set up the animation on our texture now. Next we need to configure the parameters for our emitter, but before we do that, let's just have a look at our polygon object. I'm just going to select this and switch to polygon mode. If we select all the polygons, you can see that the normals of this are pointing outwards. You can tell from the color. If the normals are pointing the other way, then these will have a blue tint. And what we really want to do is we want to emit the particles actually into the volume. And at the moment you can see that when we press play, the particles are all emitting outwards. So the easiest way to fix that is we can invert the normals. Now obviously that's not always an option. If we select the emitter itself, we have the particle direction here, thong normal. If we pull this across, you can see we have the option here to invert. I'm actually going to invert the normals on my object, but you could do it using the emitter. So I'm just going to choose reverse normals, and you can see that now they have this kind of blue tint, which shows us that this is the opposite of the normal direction. Now we've done that, we can actually hide this object. We don't really need to see that anymore. So now when we press play, you can see that we can almost see the shape of the logo, and we have particles traveling in all directions, obviously based on our texture. If we take this polygon object, let's right click on here, come down to our X particles tags and add in an XP collider tag. And what that means is that the particles are going to now collide with the polygons of this object. So if we now press play, you can see that what's happening is that all of those particles are essentially getting trapped inside. So we're starting to get the effect that we're after. Let's just rewind and come up and select our emitter object, and we can now go through and change some of the parameters on here. The first thing I'm going to do with the emitter is switch to the Groups tab, and at the bottom here we have the option Create and Add Group. So we've created a new group called Particle Group 1. Now the whole point of groups and particles is that you can allocate certain particles into certain groups, and once you've done that you can then apply restrictions or modifiers that will only affect the particles that are in that group. So if for instance you were like having a whole bunch of leaves on the floor, if you were brushing those leaves up, you could have it so that the wind only affected the particles that raised off the ground, because you could move them into a new group. The reason that I'm going to do this will become apparent fairly soon. When you apply particles into a group with X particles, the group takes over the control of the display settings and certain parameters such as speed, radius, mass, etc. And you can see all of those here. So if we press play now, you can see that we have a whole bunch of white particles. And the reason that they're not displaying the green color is because the emitter under the object is using the color channel to define the color of the particles. If we set that to none and rewind and press play, you can see that they're now green. And just to show that it's the particle group controlling that, let's just change them to say orange. And there we go, and you can see that they're now orange. I'm just going to undo to leave them as green. Next thing to worry about is the amount of particles that we're emitting. So let's come back to our emitter, switch to the emission tab, and down here you can see that we have our birth rate, and this is the number of particles that are being emitted per second. I'm going to set this to 0. I'm going to add a key. If we then scrub through to frame 25, and now I'm going to set this to be, say, 400. Add in another key, and let's scrub through to frame 50 and set this back to 0 and add another key. The other thing that I want to change in here is the life of our particles. At the moment they're set to have a full lifespan, so they're going to live for the duration of our project. Let's uncheck that and rewind. Rather than having a lifespan of 75 frames, let's reduce that to 35. Let's also add in some variation. So let's set this to a variation of 20 frames. And what that means is that some of the particles are now going to live for 15 frames, and some of them will live for up to 55 frames. And they're going to kind of live for anywhere in between those values. If we rewind and press play now, and there we go. So that's looking pretty good. If you haven't done so yet, it's probably a good idea to save your project at this time. Now I don't actually want to render these particles as dots. I want to use them to generate some splines, and to do that we can use the X particles trail object. It's a bit like the tracer object that comes with Cinema 4D, but it has a lot more options. So with that emitter selected, choose X particles, come down and add in XP trail. I'm going to call this trail 01. You can see that because we had that emitter selected, it's automatically added that emitter into this field here. Let's press play and see what happens now. And there we go. And you can see that we're getting these splines generated from our particles as they bounce backwards and forwards inside that volume. So we're starting to get a result. It's looking a bit clunky, but we can certainly improve on this. Now, one of the things I'd like to do is reduce the trail so that it doesn't last forever. At the moment it's set to full scene trail, which means that the trail that's created, or the spline that's generated from our trail object, will remain for the duration of our project. I want that to only have a short lifespan, so I'm going to uncheck this. I'm going to set the trail length to be around 12, and I'm also going to add some variation in here of around 5 frames. So some of them are going to be a little bit longer, some of them will be a little bit shorter. So if we rewind and press play now, you can see that the trails die off as well. The shape that we are getting from those trails isn't particularly interesting. It could be more interesting. I'm actually going to just hide this emitter so that we don't see it, so we just see our trail object. Next thing to do is to come up to the X Particles menu, come down to Modifiers, Motion, and add in XP Network. What XP Network does is it creates a kind of grid pattern from the particle motion. So after a certain distance or a certain number of frames, the particles will change direction, and we can adjust the number of frames that happens in. We can adjust the angle, all sorts of parameters in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this so that it changes every, say, 7 frames, maybe with a variation of 2. Let's just rewind and press play and have a look at the result there. Okay, so you can see it's starting to look a little bit more interesting. Under the Object tab for the Network Modifier, we have this operation which is currently set to standard. If we change this to inside volume and we drag our Lux Polys object, what's going to happen then is it's going to use the volume of that object to create our network pattern. When you use the inside volume operation, the particles will actually bounce off the inside of a volume. You can check that the particles are inside that volume. Normally, to use the operation inside volume, you would place your emitter within a polygon or a primitive object, but because we're using the actual polygon object itself as an emitter and we're emitting inside, we don't need to worry about that. We don't need to worry about the location of our emitter at all, because essentially our polygons are our emitters. You could come to the collision or the collider tag that we have and uncheck enable collisions. And let's just have a look and see what happens now. And you can see that now we've done that, quite a lot of the particles escape and we get this really interesting pattern. If we enable collisions, you can see that none of them escape and the logo itself is nice and clearly defined. So I think it'd be nice to have a combination of the two, so that we have some particles that are trapped inside, clearly defining the logo, and we have some that are outside, just to make the whole thing feel a little bit more organic, perhaps. Not particularly organic with this kind of digital network effect, but I think it just looked more interesting. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to choose XP Network. I'm going to name this O1. So here we have our particle group 1 with our emitter O1. We have our network, and we have our trail. And these are all essentially one group. If we add another emitter into the scene, however, this network modifier will also affect that second emitter. So what we can do is we can switch to the Groups Affected tab, and we can grab our particle group 1 and drag and drop this into here. That means that this network object will only affect particles from group 1. So we've essentially built our basic setup, not too complicated, produces a quite nice result. But what I want to do now is duplicate the whole setup, but have it so that the second group doesn't have the restriction of colliding with the inside. If we select our collider tag, you can see that we have a groups affected field here as well. So I'm going to just take my particle group 1 and drag and drop that in there. So that means that this collider tag will only affect particles in group 1. If we emit particles and place them into a different group, they won't be affected. I'm going to take my XP emitter, control drag to create a duplicate, and call this emitter O2. Let's switch to the Groups tab and delete particle group 1. I'm going to take particle group 1 and control drag to duplicate that. It automatically calls itself particle group 2, and just so we know that we have some different particles in our second group, I'm going to change the color here. Let's select our emitter and drag this particle group 2 into the groups to use under the groups tab. So this second emitter still has all of the same settings with the animation, the object, the texture tag, etc. I'm going to take this XP Network 01 and I'm going to control drag this to create a second one and call this Network 02. And this time what I want to do is delete particle group 1 and drag in particle group 2. So this network modifier only affects group 2. If we switch to the object tab, let's first of all adjust the random seed just so that we get a different network pattern, and I'm also going to make these change slightly later, maybe every 10 frames with a 5-frame variation. So we're going to have two slightly different network patterns being generated, but they will look very similar. Finally, let's grab our XP trail and duplicate that by holding down Control, and we call this trail 02, and it's currently linked to emitter 1, so we just need to drag emitter 2 into that field. If we just switch off these trail objects for a moment, and let's just unhide our emitters, rewind to the beginning and press play. Okay, and the colours are very similar. Let's just make this blatantly different. So we've got a pink colour and a kind of green colour. And there you go, and you can see we now have two groups of particles, all emitting very similarly, but you notice that the pink particles here are kind of escaping in these middle areas. So if we enable our trail objects, and let's hide these emitters once again. Now when we press play, you can see we have a little bit of both. So we have some of the particles staying within the volume and some of them escaping. Now if we come in nice and close and have a look at this, he says, where has it gone? There it is. You can see that it looks far more interesting up close. So if you get to these positions such as this, and let's rewind and press play now, you can see that you get some really interesting results, and you can fly like literally through these networks as they're being created. That's looking pretty cool. One of the things that I would like to change is the look of the line. At the moment you can see that the lines are very rigid. We could make them a little bit more organic just by adding in some corners onto them so they're slightly rounded. One of the ways that we can do that is we can just change the type of spline that's being generated. In the Object Manager, let's select our XP Trail 01 and our XP Trail 02, and if we come down to the bottom of the Object tab, you can see that we have here some parameters which you're probably familiar with when working with splines. You can see the type that it's creating is a linear spline. Let's change that to a B-spline. And the other thing that we want to do is add in some intermediate points. If we just leave it as a B-spline and press play, we're not going to see any difference because it's not creating any intermediate points. If we just set this to be, say, natural, and we'll leave it at number 8 for now. Now it's going to create lots of intermediate points, and you can see that as it does that, we get these really nice curves around the corners. Now you do want to be a little bit careful with the number here. If you take this too high, you're going to be creating a lot of points, and your scene might slow down. But with this amount of splines, it's there's not really any hit with performance at all. You can see it's looking pretty rad. So essentially that is the X-Particles part of the tutorial completed. Now we need to work out how we're going to render this out. So let's just rewind and save the project once again. Now there are a few different ways that we can render these trails out. Obviously we could drop that into a sweep and we could create some geometry from it. I'm going to use hair to render it. Hair will render really fast and it won't give us any performance here. If we use a sweep, for instance, then we're going to be creating a lot of geometry and the whole thing would become considerably slower. In the Material Manager, let's choose Create, Shader, and add a hair material. Grab this hair material and let's just drag and drop this onto our Trail 01. So Trail 01 is the trail that remains within the actual volume, and Trail 02 is the trail that escapes sometimes. Select that hair material. Under the color tab, you can see it's got a sort of browny hair color. We don't want that. We're going to create something a bit more interesting. Let's just create some kind of bright light blue, something like so, and let's do the same at the other end, but we'll just make it go towards green a little bit. So we just get a little bit of variation in the hue. So now if we just press play and render, you can see that we're getting a result. Okay, and if we come in a bit closer and have a look, and there you go. So it's looking pretty rad already. I think that it's a bit thick, so let's come to the thickness, and at the moment it's set to 1 centimeter at the root and 0.1 at the tip. So in other words, the hair gets thinner as it goes along. We don't want to do that. We're going to keep the thickness the same all the way along, and let's set this particularly thin. Let's go 0.05, 0.05, and now if we render, you can see it looks far more delicate and it looks more interesting. Obviously, the closer that we get to it, the thicker it becomes. And you could certainly play around with this and adjust things like the specular, and you can notice that we're getting a variation in brightness where the default light is hitting these strands of hair and giving these specular highlights. But I think that that's quite interesting, like this. But by all means, feel free to experiment. And of course, we're not rendering all of these splines at the moment because this trail object doesn't have a tag. So let's call this hair thick, and let's control drag to duplicate this and call this one hair thin. And I'm going to leave all the parameters on this hair material the same. The only difference is that I'm going to make it about half the thickness. So let's set this to 0.025 on root and tip, and let's just drag and drop this onto the second trail object. Now let's render. In fact, let's select this hair thin material, switch to the color tab, and let's just make these a little bit darker so that we have a slight difference in color. In fact, let's pull this brightness right down on here, say 50, so that when we render, you know, have with these more significant lines, and we have these secondary lines that aren't quite so defined, like so. Now, of course, hair will respond to lights in the scene, so it's a good idea to throw a few lights in here. Now, it could make things a lot more interesting. The colour of the lights will have a huge influence on the rendered result, as will the position and whether or not they're casting shadows. Although we don't have that many hairs, so shadowing probably won't be too obvious. But I'm going to add in a target light, and I'm going to just set this to be an area. Let's come out a little bit so we can see what's going on. I'm also going to add a camera here, so I can just see my camera when I switch to all of my views. I can then grab my light, which I'm going to set to have shadow maps. I'm going to make this a kind of slightly warmish colour, and let's just pull this out and maybe take it up a bit higher. Let's grab this light, control drag to duplicate, and let's make this one a kind of bluey colour. Really go for it with a more of a bright blue. I'm going to set this to be about 80 intensity. Let's set the yellow light to be a bit brighter, about 110 maybe. If we grab light 2, maybe uncheck specular, grab this and just pull it around here, so this sort of lights up the parts where the main light isn't hitting it. And if we render this now, you can see the result there. If we switch off this yellow light, you can see that that light is making everything very blue. We probably want to bring that around a bit more, like so. And if we add in just our yellow light, you can see that this almost makes it go kind of towards green. And let's come in a bit closer so we can see it more clearly, like so. So you can see it's almost a aqua kind of colour. And again, let's just have a look at the two different lights and how they affect. So when we have the two of them, depending on the angle that we're looking at, will depend a lot on the result that we get. And you could, of course, animate those lights. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. We're ready to render this out. So Let's just rewind and have a look at what we've got. We have this wipe occurring. You could almost read it. You could spend a bit more time making it a little bit more legible. But it's a little bit boring just the animation on its own like this. And what I'd like to do is to set up a few cameras so that we can render out from a few different viewpoints and also render the two different trail objects separately. So to do this, I'm going to just come and add in some cameras. I have one camera here, but let me just delete that. And rather than go through and add each camera and set them up, I'm going to show you after I've done it. Okay, I've added in 4 cameras, and I think I'm going to render the duration for each of these cameras, and then when we edit it together we can either cut the shots or we can maybe overlap them, because what I've done here is I've kind of used a theme where they all travel in the same direction, and I've got the cameras traveling in a horizontal manner, all except for this sideways camera here, and you can see that travels up the side of the logo. So if we just press play, and you can see there's my logo, and you can see we have this camera here which is pointing up and traveling up the side, and then on the front of the actual logo there's a very close-up camera, one that's kind of a midpoint, and then one that's much further, a wider view of the whole thing. So if we just hide all these cameras first of all so they don't interfere with the view, and let's switch to our sideways cam and rewind, and you can see that now you get this really interesting effect. And because the camera's moving in this direction, everything moves kind of from left to right. If we switch to our close-up cam, you can see that now we have this effect. Again, everything moving from left to right, all moving at a very similar pace. If we cut to the midpoint, now you can start to see the shape of the letters, but very abstract still. And then finally we have this wide view where the camera kind of moves across and then slowly eases into almost to a still. So at this point I'm going to save again, and then what we can do is we can come to our layers, and what we can do is let's add in a few layers. So I'm going to add one here which I'm just going to call scene, and then I'm going to add main, which is our main lines, and then secondary, or you can call these whatever you like, and that's our secondary lines. If we grab our cameras and our lights and also our geometry, let's just put all of that at the top so it's together. I'm going to just hold down Control and drop those onto the scene layer. Let's grab our particle group 1, emitter 1, network 1 and trail 1, and we'll grab those and put those into our main group, and then let's take the remaining 4 objects and put those into our secondary group. So what that means now is we can solo these two, and we don't see anything. And I think the reason that we aren't seeing our results there is because we don't have our emission material on a layer. So we're actually soloing and getting rid of these. So let's grab all of our materials and let's just drop them onto that scene layer. So the scene layer is always going to be active, and then we can just switch depending which one we want to render. So let's rewind and try again. So let's just look at our secondary lines now, and there we go, and you can see that's working, and we can render and we can see the result. We can switch to the main layer, rewind, press play, and you can see there is the main line that we created. Okay, cool stuff. So that just makes it a little bit easier for rendering. So the next thing to do is to set up some render settings for each of these cameras. Let's open up our render settings. I'm going to output this at 1920 by 1080, all frames 25 frames a second. If we switch to the save option, I'm going to output Photoshop frames. Choose whatever frame format you like, 8-bit, and I'm going to also include an alpha channel, a straight alpha. As these lines are quite fine, we may want to also adjust the anti-aliasing and set this to be best, and maybe reduce the threshold down to about 5. And I personally like the look of the Mitchell filter. You may not need to use best, but you could do some test renders and see. So once we've set that up, we can right click on our render setting, choose new child, and let's call this wide. We can then give this a name, so we just call this a network logo reveal wide. And we can add another new child and call this a mid, and another new child and call this a close up, and one more and call this sideways or side. So all of these children render settings will inherit their settings from this main setting, but we can use, for instance, a different name, or perhaps we wanted, if we're having problems with one view, maybe on the close-up we need to increase the anti-aliasing, we can just increase it on here, but all of the other settings will be taken from the parent. And you can see that if we select wide, for instance, all of the names here are in normal case. If we change any of these and they become their own unique setting rather than inherited from the parent, what will happen is that they will change from being normal like this to bold. So if we say network logo reveal wide, and then I'm going to put M for the main. Once I accept that, you can see that this now becomes bold. You can right click and choose inherit parent setting, which will then revert back to the parent. But the great way of doing this, the great thing about this is that we can put all of our render settings in one place. If we suddenly decide that we want to render this at 1280 by 720, notice that all of the child settings inherit that parent. Let's set that back to 1920. And you can see that they again return to 1920. So using a parent-child hierarchy with render settings is really useful in combination with layers. It's makes your life a lot easier when you're rendering the same thing from many different cameras, or maybe different frame ranges for each of the children, you know, those kind of things. So the next thing to do is just to select each one and output. And I'm going to output the main and the secondary hair as separate passes. So we're going to have 2 renders for each camera. And you can see if I press play now and just render, it renders extremely fast. Let's just go for a close-up and render, and you can see it renders really fast. So this kind of thing, you can even get away with just rendering it on one machine. If you render it on a render farm, however, you will want to make sure that you cache all of your X particles before you send it to the farm. Let's just save incremental. Coming down to my layer manager, I'm going to just unsolo everything so we can see all of the elements within our object manager. Let's come up to the X particles menu, come down other objects and choose XP cache and add in the XP cache object. Let's switch over to our, actually before we switch to attributes, let's just drag and drop this onto our scene layer. Switching to attributes, you can see that we have the option here to build the cache. We can choose to include or exclude various objects, and we can uncheck these. We can also do things once it's being cached to like retime it by adjusting the scale here, or we can offset and we can custom play certain data. So there are a lot of options on here, but the main reason we want to do this is so that if we're using a mixed render farm, perhaps we've got like Xeons or Intels, and maybe we've got AMDs and various operating systems, you know, maybe some of them are Mac, some Windows, maybe some Linux. Chances are that they'll all calculate things slightly different. We'll get some floating point errors, and if we do that with our particle system, the chances are that they won't match up, so you'll get frames jumping between. And when we cache this, it's going to bake it into the scene. It's no longer you know, a simulation that we have to play from the beginning. We can scrub backwards and forwards, and everything is sort of set in stone, and you can't change any of that unless you empty the cache, change your parameters and recache it. So all you need to do is, with that selected, just click build cache. As soon as you do that, you can see that what it does is it adds in a caching tag to the emitters and the trail objects so that they're all cached, and they change color depending on the state. Once it's complete, they turn red, and we can select these various tags, and you can see that we have controls here as well, so we can override the main cache object. So the first thing I'm going to do here is just select these two, drop these onto my main layer, and I'm going to select these two and drop these onto my secondary layer. Now I can solo these two, I can send this off to my render farm, and I know that everything's going to render as I see it in the viewport. So you need to come into your render settings, choose the appropriate one, wide, choose the appropriate camera, set your layers, hit render, come back, switch it to each camera, and obviously render out all of your passes. Once you've rendered everything out, there's only one other thing left to do, and that is to export the camera for all of these cameras. And if we come into our render settings, And we can just choose our render setting here. Under the save options, we have compositing project file. We need to fold this down and check include 3D data. Target application After Effects. Now you do need to have a path in here for it to work, so you probably best to use one of these actually. Then what you can do is you click Save Project File, and it will save the 3D data for any lights and the active camera, etc. And do this for all of your cameras. Alternatively, you could open this cinema file into After Effects and use Cineware, and you could extract the camera from there. It's entirely up to you, but I'm just going to do it the old school way of exporting an AEC for my cameras. Once I've done that, I can save my project and close this down, and we can move over to After Effects, and we're just going to do a very small treatment on this just to kind of add a little bit extra to it. Right, here we are in After Effects. I'm working in After Effects CC 2014. I've imported all the AEC files, and as you probably know, that will bring in all of these comps, the lights and cameras, and all the footage, but I've just deleted the footage because there's something I wanted to show you. I actually deleted all the lights as well because I don't need the lights. I'm just interested in the cameras. For those of you that work in 3D and use a lot of image sequences, and you're probably re-rendering and swapping them out, can know how painful that is. You know, when you've got 10 or 20 shots and you've got like 10 passes for each shot, and if you need to change those, it can become very tedious. So I use a script called Immigration, and I've currently got the beta installed, but it's only just because there was a couple of features of CC 2014 that needed updating. But we sell this script on helloluxx.com, and it's worth its weight in gold. So you can choose a recent location, or you can just hit Browse. You navigate to your folder, and then what will happen is it will show you all of those image sequences, as you can see here, as single files. Not only does it do that, it allows you to import them all in one go, which is a huge time saver. But once you've got them into your project, you can actually use Immigration to replace them as well. So if, for instance, I wanted to place just the M shots here, I can select them in here. I can come into my script window, and I can select the files that I want to replace it with. These are the same files, but it's the same principle. And then just hit Replace, and it just replaces them just like that. And it's got a very intelligent file naming recognition system, so if the file names change slightly, or you can just go through them one by one and switch them out, but it's definitely a lot quicker and a lot less painful than doing it the Adobe way, which means trudging through thousands of files in the Finder or Windows Explorer, which is never a very nice experience. So I definitely recommend checking out Immigration at helloluxx.com. So we have all our clips imported. Let's just open one up and have a quick look. There we go. And we've got the secondary and the main lines as two separate passes. But because it's hair, it just rendered so fast. And you can see that it's really got a kind of futuristic sort of Tron-y kind of feel. So I think that we should aim to treat it like that and just enhance that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a bunch of tools from Red Giant software. Some of them you may or may not be familiar with. I'm going to be using Universe, Red Giant Universe. Now, Red Giant Universe comes in a couple of flavors. There are a whole bunch of free plugins, so you just get Red Giant software, register, and you can download Red Giant Universe and have access to all of those free plugins. They also have a premium set of plugins as part of Universe, and there are some really good tools there. The other Red Giant tools that I'm going to use are from Trapcode, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with those. I'm actually going to just use Trapcode Form, but if you don't have Form, you can probably achieve a very similar result using Particular, and this is what we've got these cameras for. So I'm going to work on the mid shot, and we'll just have a bit of a play around and treat this, and then I'm going to bring all of the clips together and do a kind of final look over the top of it. So let's grab our mid clips here and just drop these in, and let's just have a quick preview of how this is looking. And you can see that we've got our two different lines. We've got these much finer lines, hopefully you can see that, and then the main line which stands out a bit more. So they're quite nice, they support each other, they're very similar. I'm going to add in some particles that match this camera move. So if we first of all just add in a new solid, I'm I'm going to just create a simple black solid, and I'm going to pull that to the bottom, and let's rename this form. Come up and choose effects, trap code, add in trap code form. Okay, so we can't see any difference in our comp, and if we had thought about this beforehand, perhaps we would have added some nulls in Cinema with external compositing tags, and we could then use those to locate or link with some expressions onto our form object. But I know that the logo that I added was at world 0, so if we come into form and we reset the parameters to 0, there you go, we can now see form, and we can actually just pull this down, and if we scrub through, you can see that that's now matching our camera move. Obviously we don't want this many particles in our scene. Let's just grab our center Z and increase that, so we can just push that back a bit, so it's kind of behind our lines. I'm not really worried about the positioning being too accurate. Let's just increase the Y so that it's kind of around about 150, so it's more or less in the center. Now we can make it a bit wider, you know, somewhere around 400, maybe a bit higher, and perhaps even a bit deeper, so we bring some of them towards us, something like so. Now it's 70 by 70 by 3. Let's change this and set this to be, say, 10 by 10, so we only have a few dots, and let's have a look, and there we go, and you can see that's all kind of matching up. It could actually be a bit wider. Let's make that a bit wider. Rather than it appearing as this kind of perfect grid, we're going to break that up a bit. So let's fold down the particle. Let's set the feather to 100. The size of 1 seems about right, but I'm going to increase the size random to 100 and the opacity random to 100. Okay, so there we go. You know, they're small and subtle. The next thing to do is to perhaps change the color. So let's make them maybe slightly bluish, like so. Now I'm going to come down to the fractal field, and here we can displace them, and if we just drag this up to maybe about 100, in fact let's just come up and increase the amount of particles so you can really see this nice and clearly. There we go. So you can see that by dragging that displacement, set that back to 0, here we've got our grid as we displace them using that fractal. Now if we preview this, you know, they're moving quite fast. We want it to be a lot more subtle than that. So we come down to our flow evolution, and what we can do here is just reduce that. It's currently set to 50. Let's set that down to around 20. And if we just set these to be 10 by 10 again, and let's just have a quick preview of that. And almost moving a bit too fast still, but let's wait and see. And there we go. So they're just really subtle, a few particles added in there. Okay. Rather than all of these particles looking the same, we could use a custom particle, but I'm going to just come down to rendering here and choose full render with DOF, depth of field. Let's double click our camera and adjust the settings here. I'm just going to enable depth of field and set the f-stop to be, say, 2. And there we go, and you can see that now some of these particles are a bit softer, the ones that are in the foreground, and they're going to be softer as they get further away. Let's just take this form and duplicate it, Apple D or Command D. And for this I'm going to choose particle type star. And you can see that all of those stars now end up in the same place. Reduce the number of particles down to 3 in X, Y and Z, so we don't have so many. We can also, you know, just adjust the size a little bit so that they don't position in the same place. And what we want to do now is come down to the rendering and set our transfer mode to be add, and then we can see the 2 layers of form. So we've got 2 layers of form on that layer. Okay. Next I'm going to select the secondary render. We can solo that just so we can see our lines. Let's add an effect, color correction, levels, individual controls. I'm going to switch to the alpha and just crush that alpha a bit because the, let's just view that 100%. You know, the lines are quite faint. So if we just crush that alpha, you can see that brings them right up. So we don't want to take it that far, that extreme, but let's just make them a little bit more obvious, somewhere around there. Next, I'm going to come down and choose one of the red giant universe, and you can see that we've got all of these various options for red giant universe. I'm going to add in the distort chromatic aberration. Okay, and you can see that that essentially kind of splits apart the color channels and adds in some camera distortion and adds in this dirt. This is a pretty heavy-handed effect, to be honest, and I really want a very subtle effect here. So I'm going to tone back all of these parameters so that they are a lot more subtle. So let's set the red distortion to be, say, 5, and the green distortion 6, say, and the blue to be 4. I'm also going to set the scale here to be much more subtle. So it's 1.010. Let's put 1.001. So it's a tenth of what it was before. And let's set this to 0.999. If we fold down the blur parameters here, I'm going to set the edge blur to be 0 and the radial blur, I think I'll just leave that as it is. And I'm going to switch the lens texture to none. So it's a pretty subtle effect now. If we just switch that off, you can see we've got a slight distortion, and if we come up to 100%, you can see that we get this quite heavy aberration at the edges, but in here it's nice and subtle. And we will be treating this again, so we will be enhancing it a little bit more. Let's select the mid lines and solo that. And all I want to do here is just add in a really nice subtle glow. If we come to the universe plugins again, there's a whole bunch of glows here. I'm going to use diffuse glow. Okay. A bit too subtle right now. Can't really see much of a glow on there at all. Let's just switch it on and off. Yeah, you see not much different. Let's take this threshold and bring this down. Okay. And let's take the intensity up. And I think the radius is too high. If we set that maybe to 1, and there we go, now you can see, and that's probably a bit too full on. Let's set the intensity to about 3, and the radius maybe to 2, just so it's a bit more subtle. And there we go, so you can just see that difference on around here. So again, very, very subtle. So we've just added in some really, really simple effects here. And if we just preview this now, and I think what I'd like to do is have it so that the particles aren't visible straight away, and they kind of fade up and then fade down towards the end. And I'm going to treat all of the clips in a very similar way. And there we go, and you can see that when we get these lines, and there's a few of them together, we get these nice glows over the top of it. So let's just have a look. Not very keen on this star whizzing across here. Maybe we just need to adjust the parameters in form. Okay, I'm going to leave it like that for now. So with the form layer, let's just press T to bring up our opacity, and somewhere around the middle here, I'm going to set that to be about 75. I'm going to add a key. Then I'm going to go to the beginning, set this to 0, and then go to the end and set that to 0 again. So now if we just solo that layer and have a quick preview, you can see that it just appears and then disappears. Very, very subtle. Okay, cool stuff. Now we can close this down. The next thing to do would be to go through all of these comps and set them up in a similar way. And now you're going to need to adjust the position of form and maybe the settings depending on how far and how close we are to each one. Once we've done that, we can grab all of these and drop them into another comp. So I'm just going to go through and set each one of these up, and then come back to you. Okay, so here is my main comp with all of my clips in. I'm going to start with the sideways clip. And as we get towards the end, before it starts to disappear, I'm going to bring in the next clip. So let's bring that on, and let's just set that somewhere around here. So as we come out of that first clip, we get an overlap, and the second clip, which is the close-up, starts to appear. And again, just as this starts to disappear off that side, let's bring in the mid clip. So we've got a nice overlap between each one. Maybe a bit more. And then again, before this final clip disappears, let's bring this final shot in. Like so. Up, soloed. There we go. Okay, so we've got all of the effects on there, and now we've got all the shots together. We can just give it one final treatment. I'm going to just do a RAM preview. And there we go. And you can see that because we used very similar camera moves and the same kind of tempo with a very similar subject between all of the shots, that they kind of marry together really nicely. And then at the end we have the reveal of the logo. So I mentioned before about looking in kind of futuristic Tron kind of style. So that's the sort of look that I'm going to go for. I'm going to grab my black solid and just drop that underneath. Let's solo that for a moment. Let's choose generate and add in just a gradient ramp. Set this to be radial. Maybe swap those colors around. Bring that white down to the middle. And let's bring this other over to the corner. And let's set this to be, you know, like a kind of a very dark blue, something like so. Okay, let's come into the middle around here, and you can see just that on its own adds something. Again, let's call that background. Let's come back to our project, grab this black solid. I'm going to drop this above now and add in like a classic vignette. And to do that, I'm going to simply add in a circular mask, invert this, and then feather. You know, something like so. But I just want to transform this so that the edges kind of disappear to black. But let's pull this like so. So the vignette is more at the sides. If we just toggle that, something like so. Finally, I'm going to add one more effect over the whole thing, and this is part of the Red Giant Universe toolset, and I'm going to add this here, and it's called holomatrix, and it's designed specifically for creating those kind of hologram matrix effects, which seems perfect for this shot. So let's set this as an adjustment layer and come up to the effects menu, and let's choose stylize holomatrix. And I believe this is a premium plugin, but I'm not, to be honest, I'm not sure, but I think maybe you get the easy version as a freebie, and this is the super version. Okay, and you can see it's immediately giving it that kind of like security camera Tron kind of feeling. I'm going to choose a preset from here, Vision Security Camera. Okay, but I'm going to just come and change a few of the parameters because it's affected quite a lot of the elements. Let's set this at 100% so we can see what's going on, and we can see a section of it. So we've got some parameters here that are kind of global parameters, and then we fold down the effects, and you can see that there are a whole bunch of effects that you can apply, and depending on whether you check these boxes depends on whether that effect is applied or not. Colorization I'm going to uncheck. I don't really want it to colorize. You can see that we've also got some color separation. We can clearly see our RGB channels there, and here we've got color separation, so we could switch that off, or we could just maybe tone it down. So let's fold this down, and the amount of separation, I'm going to set that to 0.5. Okay, so it's a lot more subtle. I'm going to switch off these scan lines, Okay, let's just zoom out a bit so we can see the whole thing. And you can see that we've got this kind of noise over the whole piece, which is static, kind of like that. Makes it look a bit dirty. Also think we could add in some glow, so let's add our glow, and let's also add secondary glow. If we fold down the glow settings, the threshold is currently set at 92. We could really take that a lot lower to bring up those glows. Let's set that maybe around 30, perhaps even lower, 20. Finally, I'm also going to add in lines, so let's enable lines. Okay, and this kind of adds in scan lines, but almost like big blocks of it that move up and down on the screen. So there we go. Pretty simple, but a nice, effective plugin and fairly appropriate for this kind of treatment. Just by adding in these few extra elements. I think perhaps that glow is a bit too much now. Maybe it's that secondary glow. Yeah, switch that off. Okay. I kind of like the secondary glow. Maybe we just need to take that threshold up a bit more to about 45. Let's have a look at the end here. Yeah, that's better. So we kind of created this grungy techno effect. It's looking pretty sweet. Okay, I've rendered this out so we can have a look at the final result. Just need to find some groovy audio to drop onto this. One thing that I forgot to mention was that we need to just make sure we adjust the frame rate in the holomatrix effect. So I've set that to 25, depending on whether you want to have a, a slower frame rate if you're trying to simulate film, or if you just kind of like that stop motion-y feel. I'll set mine up to 25, but you can see, it looks pretty nice. It's a nice addition. It grades well. Let's have a look at the final result, but before we do that, I just wanted to thank you for watching the tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. Just shows the power of X particles and some of the cool stuff you can do using Red Giant Universe, and of course Trapcode plugins never fail. If you're interested in purchasing X particles, then please check out helloluxx.com. We offer extremely competitive pricing. It's such a cool effect that we want everyone to have it, so we don't mind reducing our margin considerably more than most other resellers. And of course, there are plenty more tutorials and a whole bunch of training there too. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Have fun with all those wonderful particle systems. Catch you next time.